On an October morning in 1823, shrouded in fog, the residents of Charleston County, South Carolina, discovered something that would haunt their community for generations. Overnight, 7 enslaved individuals had vanished from the Ravenscraft plantation, leaving behind only their shackles and a single document, blood-stained, bearing the seal of Colonel Thaddeus Ravenscraft. A web of betrayal, greed, and calculated cruelty that reached into the highest circles of Southern society would be exposed by what authorities found in that document. Fortunes have been spent by the Ravenscraft family for nearly 2 centuries to keep this story buried. But the true horror of what became known as the Wedding Gift Massacre is now revealed by recently discovered correspondence. Not just his own family, but the power structure of an entire region would be reshaped by the truth about Colonel Ravenscraft's gift to his bride. Before the story of Colonel Thaddeus Ravenscraft and his deadly matrimonial arrangement continues, make sure you're subscribed to our channel for more dark historical mysteries. And in the comments, let us know what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow history enthusiasts who appreciate the shadows of America's past. The most damning piece of evidence of human calculation I have ever witnessed was how Charleston's mayor would later describe the document that survived that terrible night. But to journey back to where this nightmare began is required for understanding its true meaning. Everything the antebellum South aspired to become was represented by Charleston County in 1822. Like green seas, cotton plantations stretched across the landscape, their profits funding grand mansions and elaborate social gatherings that mimicked European aristocracy. More respect was commanded by few among the plantation elite than Colonel Thaddeus Ravenscraft, a man whose military service in the War of 1812 had earned him both substantial government land grants and honor. The calculating mind of a born strategist was possessed by Ravenscraft. Attention in every room he entered was commanded by a man standing well over 6 feet tall with penetrating grey eyes and a precisely groomed beard. The authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience was carried by his voice, whether from soldiers under his command or the 200 enslaved individuals who worked his vast cotton fields. A man of rigid principles and unwavering determination was described by those who knew him, qualities that had built his fortune and would ultimately orchestrate his downfall. Over 3,000 acres of prime South Carolina soil were encompassed by the Ravenscraft plantation, worked by enslaved families who had served the family for generations. Detailed records on every individual were maintained by Ravenscraft, unlike many plantation owners who viewed their human property merely as economic units. Their skills, their family connections, their personal histories, and, most disturbingly, their estimated monetary value, updated monthly based on market conditions and physical capabilities. From one of Savannah's most prominent families came his bride-to-be, Miss Cordelia Peyton. At 23, she possessed both an inheritance that would substantially increase the Ravenscraft holdings and the refined education expected of a Southern lady. A perfect union of military honor and old plantation money was how their engagement, announced in the spring of 1822, was celebrated. That Cordelia harbored ambitions extending far beyond the traditional role of a plantation wife could not have been known by the wedding guests. Unusual interest in the management aspects of plantation life had been expressed by Cordelia during their courtship, conducted through formal visits and carefully chaperoned walks through Ravenscraft's gardens. While most ladies of her station concerned themselves with household management and social obligations, detailed questions about crop yields, labor organization, and profit margins were asked by her. Information typically reserved for male associates and potential business partners began to be shared by Ravenscraft, impressed by her business acumen. A woman whose intelligence matched her beauty emerged, but whose moral compass had been warped by a childhood surrounded by immense wealth built on human suffering. Not just through cotton, but through the buying and selling of enslaved individuals across multiple states had Cordelia's father, Horatio Peyton, made his fortune. Human beings as commodities to be traded, bred, and disposed of according to market demands were how she had grown up viewing them. The social event of the season was what their wedding, scheduled for October 1822, promised to be. To plantation families from Virginia to Louisiana, invitations went out, and preparations began for a celebration that would last 3 days. No expense was spared by Ravenscraft, importing French champagne, hiring musicians from New Orleans, and even commissioning a special set of china from England, bearing the combined Ravenscraft and Peyton family crests. but a request that would set in motion a chain of events destroying everything Ravenscraft had built was made by Cordelia as the wedding approached. For something no Southern bride had ever requested as a wedding gift, she asked her fiancé during a private dinner in September. Complete ownership and control over 7 specific enslaved individuals from his plantation. In Ravenscraft's private study, a room lined with military maps, family portraits, and ledgers documenting every aspect of his plantation empire, the conversation took place. Across the cotton fields, September thunder rolled outside as Cordelia presented her unusual request with the same calm precision she might use to discuss flower arrangements or menu selections. "My dear Thaddeus," she began, her voice carrying an undertone that made the colonel shift uncomfortably in his leather chair, "I have been considering how best to contribute to our household's prosperity after our marriage. Greater service than you might expect is what I believe I can be of." With disturbing clinical detail, Ravenscraft listened as his bride-to-be outlined her proposal. 7 specific individuals, a family unit consisting of parents, 3 adult children, and 2 grandchildren, she wanted transferred to her complete ownership through legal documents that would make her their sole master, independent of her husband's authority. Both personal and profitable was her reasoning, she explained. "A perfect experimental group is represented by these 7, Cordelia continued, producing a leather portfolio filled with detailed notes about each individual. Valuable skills in blacksmithing and textile work are possessed by the older generation. A woman with exceptional ability in herbal medicine and healing is included in the middle generation, and a man with remarkable strength suited for the heaviest field work. Young enough to be molded according to new training methods I have researched are the children." The true nature of her experimental methods was what Cordelia did not initially reveal. Through correspondence with contacts in Cuba and Brazil, plantation management techniques considered too extreme even by antebellum Southern standards had been learned by her. These methods involved systematic psychological manipulation, controlled breeding programs, and punishment systems designed to break not just individual will, but family bonds that might interfere with absolute obedience. In an unprecedented situation, Ravenscraft found himself. Fundamental assumptions about marriage roles and property ownership that formed the bedrock of Southern society were challenged by Cordelia's request. Household slaves were typically managed by wives, but field hands were not owned by them independently. Nor did they involve themselves in the brutal calculations required for maximum labor extraction. Yet intrigue was also felt by him at her business proposal. Unpredictably, cotton prices had been fluctuating, and ways to increase efficiency and reduce costs were being sought by plantation owners throughout the region. Applied across his entire labor force, her methods could be, if they proved successful, potentially increasing profits by substantial margins. What they called the Peton method, a comprehensive system for managing enslaved individuals that would maximize both productivity and psychological control, was developed by them over several nights of discussion. As test subjects, the 7 chosen individuals would serve, and whether the methods would be expanded plantation-wide after the wedding would be determined by their responses. Complex legal arrangements proved to be requiring discretion that extended beyond normal business confidentiality. Charleston attorney Marcus Bellwether, a man known for handling sensitive plantation legal matters with absolute discretion, was retained by Ravenscraft. Documents that would transfer complete ownership of the 7 individuals to Cordelia upon their marriage were drawn up by Bellwether, with provisions that would keep the arrangement secret from other plantation owners and local authorities. A clause Cordelia insisted upon was what made the arrangement particularly sinister. To a remote section of the plantation, the 7 individuals would be relocated where her experiments could proceed without interference from other enslaved workers or observation by visitors. Both living quarters and a location for implementing the new management techniques would be served by a separate building disguised as a textile workshop. That his bride's unusual request represented forward-thinking business innovation rather than calculated cruelty was what Ravenscraft convinced himself of as October approached. Through calculated risks and strategic thinking, he had built his fortune, qualities he now recognized in Cordelia. More than a social union would be their marriage. A business partnership designed to revolutionize plantation management throughout the South was what it would be. That word of their unusual arrangement would reach ears beyond their trusted circle was anticipated by neither of them, setting in motion events that would transform their wedding celebration into something far more sinister. October 15, 1822, dawned with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made Charleston County seem like a paradise on earth. For the wedding celebration, the Ravencraft plantation had been transformed, with white silk ribbons adorning the oak trees lining the main drive and tables laden with delicacies arranged across the mansion's expansive grounds. Throughout the morning, over 200 guests arrived, their carriages creating a procession that stretched for miles along the country roads. Some of the most powerful families in the antebellum South were among the wedding guests. Governor Richardson himself attended along with plantation owners whose combined wealth could influence state and federal legislation, senators, and judges. In the plantation's garden pavilion, the ceremony took place, with Cordelia radiant in imported French silk and Ravencraft resplendent in his military dress uniform. But during the gift presentation ceremony, a tradition where the groom publicly announced his wedding present to his bride, the true significance of the day would emerge. This moment had been planned carefully by Ravencraft, understanding that his gift would be discussed in drawing rooms from Virginia to Louisiana for months to come. What would become the most infamous wedding speech in South Carolina history was begun by Ravencraft, standing before the assembled guests and calling for attention. "My dear friends," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the garden, "it is customary for a groom to present his bride with jewels, fine clothing, or perhaps a new carriage, but something far more practical and forward-thinking has been requested by my beloved Cordelia." With growing fascination, the crowd listened as Ravencraft described his gift, the legal ownership of 7 enslaved individuals, chosen specifically for their diverse skills and potential for what he termed innovative management approaches. His bride's business acumen and her desire to contribute actively to the plantation's prosperity through improved labor efficiency methods were spoken of by him. A respected military officer praising his wife's entrepreneurial spirit and commitment to plantation improvement was what the guests heard. That at that very moment, the 7 individuals in question were being forcibly separated from their families and relocated to the remote building where Cordelia's experiments would begin immediately following the wedding celebration was what they could not have known. Mixed, but generally positive, was the reaction among the wedding guests. To inquire about Cordelia's methods, several plantation owners approached Ravencraft throughout the evening, expressing interest in similar arrangements with their own wives. A progressive adaptation to changing economic conditions was how the idea of involving educated Southern ladies more directly in plantation management struck many. Favorably, not everyone present viewed the announcement, however. Deeply disturbed by the clinical language Ravencraft used when describing human beings as experimental subjects and management test cases, found himself Dr. Edmund Fitzgerald, the county physician who had treated enslaved individuals on multiple plantations. Similarly, fundamentally wrong with treating marriage gifts as opportunities for what sounded like systematic cruelty was recognized by Reverend Samuel Hartwell, whose congregation included several plantation families. Additional details that should have alarmed more guests than they did were provided by Cordelia herself as the evening progressed and champagne flowed freely. Enthusiastically, she spoke about breaking family dependencies that interfere with labor efficiency and establishing new psychological frameworks for absolute obedience. With the same cheerful tone she used when discussing flower arrangements or menu planning, her words were delivered, making their sinister implications easy for intoxicated listeners to overlook. For 3 days, the wedding celebration continued as planned, with elaborate dinners, dancing, and entertainment that would be remembered as one of the finest social gatherings in the region's history. But in the main mansion, while guests enjoyed themselves, work had already begun in the remote building where the 7 enslaved individuals faced the beginning of Cordelia's experimental program. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Charleston County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. What happens next in this tale of calculated cruelty and its devastating consequences? Let's discover together. For several months, the true nature of Cordelia's methods would not become apparent to the outside world, but that they had become victims of something far more sinister than typical plantation brutality was understood immediately by the 7 individuals subjected to her experiments. Approximately 2 miles from the main plantation house sat the building Cordelia had designated for her experimental program, connected by a narrow path that wound through dense pine forest. Originally constructed as a tobacco drying barn during the plantation's early years, it had been extensively modified according to Cordelia's detailed specifications during the summer months leading up to her wedding. Reinforced walls, barred windows set too high to provide views of the surrounding area, and a series of small rooms designed to house individuals in isolation when Cordelia deemed separation necessary for her psychological manipulation techniques were now featured in the structure. A central chamber she referred to as the instruction room was most disturbing. Equipped with punishment apparatus and restraining devices that went far beyond anything typically found on even the harshest plantations. 3 generations of a family that had served the Ravencraft plantation for over 30 years were represented by the 7 individuals chosen for Cordelia's experiment. Valuable skills as a blacksmith and seamstress, respectively, were possessed by Joshua and Rebecca Kane, both in their 50s. In various plantation tasks, their 3 adult children, Samuel, aged 28, Mary, aged 26, and David, aged 24, had been trained and were considered among the most reliable workers on the property. Mary's 2 young children, ages 6 and 9, completed the family unit. Their strong emotional bonds and reputation for mutual support during difficult times was what made this family particularly valuable to Cordelia's purposes. That breaking these family connections would result in more compliant, productive workers who would focus entirely on their assigned tasks rather than maintaining relationships that might interfere with absolute obedience had been convinced her by her research. Systematic isolation designed to destroy the family's communication and support systems was where Cordelia's methods began. Separate living quarters were assigned to each individual, and forbidden from speaking to other family members except during supervised work periods they were. At different times, meals were provided to prevent social interaction, and punishment that affected not just the individual involved but randomly selected family members resulted from any attempt to communicate. Deliberately false information designed to create mistrust and suspicion among family members was how the psychological manipulation extended. That his son Samuel had spoken critically about his father's work performance would be told to Joshua by Cordelia while simultaneously informing Samuel that his father had requested additional punishment for his eldest son's alleged laziness. The trust and affection that had sustained the family through previous hardships were gradually eroded by these fabricated reports, creating tensions and doubts. What she called productivity bonding was what involved Cordelia's most innovative and cruel technique. Against each other in various tasks, family members were forced to compete with the understanding that superior performance by one individual would result in better treatment while inferior performance would bring punishment not just to the underperformer but to their loved ones as well. A source of fear and guilt was transformed this system into natural family loyalty, as the welfare of those they cared about most was directly affected by each person's actions. Ideal conditions for Cordelia's program were provided by the winter months, as shorter daylight hours meant longer periods of confinement and limited outside contact. Written records of each individual's responses to her various techniques were maintained in detail by her, noting changes in behavior, productivity levels, and signs of psychological breakdown with the same clinical precision she had once applied to managing her father's household accounts. Deliberately harsh, but not immediately life-threatening, were the physical conditions in the modified building. That dead or seriously injured subjects would provide no useful data and might attract unwanted attention from other plantation workers or visitors was understood by Cordelia. Instead, on creating constant discomfort and uncertainty that would wear down psychological resistance without causing visible evidence of mistreatment, she focused. Carefully calculated to maintain health while creating perpetual hunger that could be used as both punishment and reward were food rations. To prevent rest and recovery, sleeping arrangements were designed with thin mattresses, inadequate blankets, and deliberately uncomfortable sleeping positions that left individuals exhausted and more susceptible to psychological manipulation. Daily, throughout the winter months, Cordelia visited her experimental subjects, always accompanied by 2 trusted overseers who had been sworn to secrecy about the special arrangements. Their responses to her various techniques would be observed by her, each individual separately would be interviewed to assess their psychological state, and her methods would be adjusted based on what she perceived as successful or unsuccessful approaches. That her systematic cruelty was creating something more dangerous than broken individuals was what Cordelia failed to anticipate. A group of people with nothing left to lose and every reason to seek revenge against those who had destroyed their lives was what it was forging. Through the slave quarters of the main plantation, rumors about the mysterious building and its 7 missing occupants had begun circulating by February 1823. For decades, the Kane family had been respected members of the community, known for their skills, their strong family bonds, and their willingness to help others during times of illness or personal crisis. An atmosphere of fear and suspicion among the remaining enslaved population had been created by their sudden disappearance and the strict prohibition against discussing their whereabouts. Information about what had happened to the missing family began to be quietly gathered by Martha Washington, an elderly woman who had served as an unofficial community leader for over 20 years. Opportunities to overhear conversations between Ravenscraft, his new wife, and their visitors were provided by her position as head cook in the main house, while her respected status among the enslaved community made her a natural focal point for concerns and questions. A picture far more disturbing than typical plantation brutality was what Martha learned through careful observation and discreet inquiries. Specifically for their reputation for cruelty and their isolation from the main plantation community had the 2 overseers assigned to the remote building been selected. Conflicts of loyalty that might be created by family connections or close friendships were had by neither man if they were asked to participate in activities that exceeded normal punishment protocols. The supplies that had been delivered to the building throughout the winter months were more troubling. Unusual items had been observed by Martha, wagons carrying medical instruments that seemed designed for inflicting pain rather than providing treatment, restraining devices that appeared far more sophisticated than typical plantation punishment equipment, and large quantities of materials that suggested extended confinement rather than temporary disciplinary measures. But the sounds that could occasionally be heard from the direction of the remote building during quiet winter nights were perhaps most disturbing. Screams and cries that lasted for hours, followed by periods of absolute silence that seemed somehow more ominous than the sounds of obvious suffering, were reported by several plantation workers. What she called prayer circles, gatherings where enslaved individuals would meet in secret to discuss their concerns and share information about the missing family, began to be organized by Martha. Multiple purposes were served by these meetings. For a community living under constant fear, they provided emotional support. The exchange of information that might be useful for survival was facilitated by them. A sense of unity and shared purpose that had previously been prevented by the plantation's size and the diverse backgrounds of its workers was begun to be fostered by them. A picture of Cordelia's activities that went far beyond what the wedding guests had heard described as innovative management techniques emerged through these gatherings. Systematic torture designed not just to punish but to break the human spirit in ways that would make individuals incapable of resistance or independent thought was suggested by reports from those who had observed the building from a distance. A means of preserving information that might otherwise be lost or forgotten was also served by the prayer circles. That detailed accounts of everything they learned about the missing family be memorized by multiple individuals was insisted upon by Martha, ensuring that evidence of what was happening would survive, even if those who gathered it were punished or sold to other plantations. Into something more active than mere information sharing, these gatherings began to evolve as winter turned toward spring. A sense of urgency that overcame the caution and resignation that typically characterized plantation life had been created by the realization that the Kane family's fate could befall any of them at any time. For the first time in the plantation's history, not just survival strategies, but the possibility of active resistance began to be discussed by enslaved workers. Among the white community as well, word of the Ravenscraft plantation's experimental program had begun to spread, meanwhile, though in very different terms than the whispered fears circulating through the slave quarters. Meetings with Cordelia to learn about her innovative management techniques had been requested by several plantation owners from neighboring counties, and there was growing speculation that her methods might be adopted more widely throughout the region. Additional pressure for Cordelia to produce demonstrable results from her experimental program was created by this outside interest. Proof of concept for methods that might revolutionize plantation management throughout the antebellum South were what the 7 members of the Kane family had become, no longer just subjects for her personal research. As a pioneer in plantation efficiency, Cordelia would be established by their complete psychological breakdown and transformation into perfectly obedient workers. Both her methods and her reputation among the planter elite might be discredited by any failure, however. The ultimate test of whether Cordelia's experimental subjects had been successfully transformed into the kind of workers she had promised would be provided by the approaching spring planting season. But that her experiment would be remembered for very different reasons than she had anticipated was ensured by events already in motion as the days grew longer and warmer. Unseasonably warm weather to Charleston County was brought by March 1823, along with the intensive preparations that preceded spring planting season. Fields were prepared across the plantation by enslaved workers, equipment was repaired, and supplies for the months of intensive labor that would determine the year's cotton crop and the plantation's financial success were organized. The culmination of her experimental program was what the approaching planting season represented for Cordelia. Back into the plantation's general labor force, the 7 members of the Kane family would be integrated after 5 months of systematic psychological manipulation, where the effectiveness of her methods would be demonstrated to both her husband and the growing number of plantation owners who had expressed interest in similar programs by their transformed behavior. Far different from what she had intended were the changes undergone by the individuals subjected to Cordelia's experiment, however. A shared understanding that their survival depended on eliminating the source of their torment, regardless of the consequences, was what they had developed. Rather than becoming broken, compliant workers focused solely on their assigned tasks. With David Kane, the youngest of the adult siblings, whose natural leadership abilities had made him a particular target for Cordelia's psychological manipulation techniques, the transformation had begun. A cold, calculating intelligence that focused entirely on finding ways to strike back against those who had destroyed his family had been fostered instead by repeated attempts to break his spirit through punishment and isolation. Every detail of the building's layout, the routines of the overseers, and the patterns of Cordelia's visits had been spent by David, working in isolation, denied communication with his relatives, memorizing during the winter months. Which doors remained unlocked during different times of day, where tools and potential weapons were stored, and how sound carried between different sections of the building had been observed by him. More importantly, with his family members, despite Cordelia's elaborate isolation protocols, ways to communicate had been found by David. The Kane family had maintained contact through a system of coded sounds, hidden messages, and carefully timed gestures, and had begun coordinating their responses to their captors' demands. The development of a sophisticated conspiracy focused on a single objective, escape or revenge, was what the gradual breakdown of family bonds appeared to be, actually. On March 15, when Cordelia decided to implement what she called the final integration test, the breaking point came. Permanently, Mary Kane's 6-year-old daughter, little Sarah, would be separated from her mother and assigned to work in the main house, where her mother would be able to see her daily but never speak to her again. Whether the psychological conditioning had been successful in eliminating inappropriate emotional attachments that interfered with work efficiency would be demonstrated by this separation, Cordelia explained to her overseers. But for something very different than passive compliance, the Kane family was prepared when the overseers came to collect Sarah that morning. But not into broken, obedient workers, they had been transformed by the months of systematic torture. A coordinated unit focused entirely on survival and retribution with nothing left to lose and no remaining faith that submission would protect them from further cruelty was what they had become. When David Kane refused to allow the overseers to take his niece, the confrontation began. The calculated challenge of someone who had prepared for this moment for months was his defiance, not the desperate resistance of someone acting on impulse. The combined resistance of 7 people who had decided that death was preferable to continued torture was what the first overseer found himself facing when he moved to strike David for his insubordination. The systematic execution of a plan that had been developed over months of careful observation and preparation was what followed, not the chaotic violence of desperate people. Their captors' weaknesses had been identified by the Kane family, the building's vulnerabilities had been learned, and for the consequences of active resistance, they had prepared themselves. They were ready when the moment came. Experienced in controlling individual slaves through intimidation and punishment were the 2 overseers assigned to guard them. But for coordinated resistance from a group that no longer feared death, they were unprepared. Dead were both men within minutes. Killed not in a frenzy of anger, but through the careful application of tools and techniques that David and his family had planned, with the same precision Cordelia had used to design their torment. Only the beginning of what the Kane family had planned for this day was killing their immediate captors, however. During Cordelia's daily visits, they had spent months listening, her routines had been memorized, and for the opportunity to confront the person truly responsible for their suffering, they had prepared. And on the morning of March 15, exactly where to find her they knew. The same methodical approach she had applied to every aspect of her experimental program was how Cordelia Ravencroft began March 15. With her husband in the main house dining room, after breakfast, her daily observation notes were collected by her, the supplies needed for the morning's integration test were gathered, and she set out along the familiar path through the pine forest toward the remote building where her subjects awaited her arrival. The sweet scent of early spring flowers and the sounds of plantation life beginning another day were carried by the morning air. Their voices and the sounds of their tools were creating a backdrop of productive activity that reinforced Cordelia's conviction that her experimental methods would soon revolutionize plantation management throughout the South, as field hands were already at work preparing for the coming planting season. With the confident stride of someone who had never encountered resistance she could not overcome through careful planning and systematic application of pressure, she walked. Exactly according to her expectations had proceeded the 5 months of her experimental program, with each of the 7 subjects showing precisely the kind of psychological transformation that would make them ideal workers once they were integrated back into the plantation's general labor force. A scene that would haunt the nightmares of everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives was what Cordelia discovered when she reached the building. In the central instruction room, the 2 overseers lay dead, killed with tools and techniques that demonstrated both planning and intimate knowledge of human anatomy. But the evidence of systematic preparation that surrounded their bodies was far more disturbing than their deaths. Into something very different from what Cordelia had intended, the Kane family had used their months of confinement to transform the building. Into weapons, tools had been modified. Escape routes had been prepared, and for what was clearly a carefully planned confrontation rather than a spontaneous act of violence, supplies had been gathered. But the realization that the 7 individuals she had believed were broken and compliant had instead been watching her, learning her routines, studying her vulnerabilities, and preparing for this moment with the same methodical precision she had used to design their torment was most disturbing of all. No longer the psychologically shattered individual Cordelia believed she had created, but someone whose intelligence and determination had been focused entirely on survival and retribution. David Kane stood in the center of the instruction room. Arranged not in the random positions of desperate people, but in the coordinated formation of individuals who had planned every detail of what would happen next, his family stood with him. "Mistress Cordelia," David said, his voice carrying none of the deference and submission that 5 months of torture were supposed to have instilled, "for you to arrive, we have been waiting. Something we want to discuss, we have." In any conventional sense, a conversation was not what followed, but rather the methodical presentation of a case that the Kane family had prepared over months of careful observation and analysis. Every aspect of Cordelia's experimental program had been documented by them, every detail of her methods had been memorized, and a comprehensive account of what had been done to them and why had been prepared. But simply to confront their tormentor with evidence of her cruelty was not their purpose. That Cordelia's experimental program was intended as a model for wider implementation and that their suffering was designed to establish methods that would be applied to enslaved individuals throughout the region had been realized by the Kane family. That Cordelia's methods died with her program would not be ensured unless they took steps, even if their escape would save others from a similar fate. Far more dangerous than a rebellious slave had David Kane become. Someone who understood exactly how the plantation system worked, who could anticipate the responses of authorities to slave rebellion, and who had developed a comprehensive plan not just for escape, but for ensuring that evidence of Cordelia's experiments would reach people capable of taking action to prevent similar programs had he become. The calculated execution of justice by individuals who had been transformed by their suffering into something their captors had never anticipated was what the confrontation that morning was, not the desperate violence of people with nothing left to lose. A story that authorities would spend decades trying to suppress would be told by the manner of her death when Cordelia's body was discovered later that day. Far beyond personal revenge, the Kane family's plan extended. Evidence had been prepared by them, documentation had been gathered, and contacts had been established that would ensure their story reached ears beyond the local authorities who might be motivated to cover up scandals that could damage the reputation of prominent plantation families. At approximately 2 o'clock on the afternoon of March 15, Colonel Thaddeus Ravencroft discovered his wife's body, when her failure to return from her daily visit to the experimental facility had become cause for concern. Not only his understanding of his wife's activities, but the entire trajectory of his life and the legacy of his family name would be reshaped by what he found in the remote building. In the central instruction room, surrounded by evidence of the experimental program that had consumed her attention for the previous 5 months, Cordelia lay. But rather than the scene of random violence that might be expected from a slave rebellion, something far more disturbing was encountered by Ravenscraft. The systematic documentation and presentation of evidence that revealed the true nature of what his wife had been doing to the 7 members of the Kane family. Into what could only be described as a museum of cruelty, the building itself had been transformed, with every tool, every restraining device, and every psychological manipulation technique carefully arranged and labeled to demonstrate the comprehensive nature of Cordelia's experimental program. In a manner that would leave no doubt about the deliberate, systematic nature of what had been done to the missing family, written documentation, including Cordelia's own detailed notes, had been organized and presented. A comprehensive written account, obviously prepared over many weeks, that detailed not only what had been done to the Kane family, but Cordelia's plans for expanding her methods throughout the plantation and her correspondence with other plantation owners who had expressed interest in similar programs was most disturbing of all. That what Ravenscraft had understood as an isolated experiment was actually intended as the foundation for a regional transformation of plantation management techniques was revealed by the document. Completely, the Kane family themselves had vanished, leaving behind only the evidence of their months of suffering and a clear indication that their escape had been planned with the same systematic precision that characterized everything else about the confrontation. That belonged to the plantation, they had taken nothing, beyond what was necessary to eliminate their captors, they had destroyed nothing, and a complete record that would make any cover-up attempt extraordinarily difficult had been left behind by them. Preventing the discovery from becoming public knowledge that would destroy not only his own reputation, but the standing of every plantation owner who had been associated with Cordelia's experimental program was Ravenscraft's immediate concern. Within hours of finding his wife's body, trusted riders had been dispatched by him to contact other members of the planter elite who needed to be warned about the potential scandal and enlisted in efforts to control the narrative. Swift and coordinated was the response. To assess the situation and develop strategies for preventing the truth about Cordelia's experimental program from reaching authorities or newspapers that might use the information to attack the entire plantation system, representatives from some of the most powerful families in South Carolina had arrived at the Ravenscraft plantation by evening. Evidence so damning that traditional cover-up methods would be inadequate was what they discovered. The systematic nature of Cordelia's cruelty, the involvement of other plantation owners in planning similar programs, and the comprehensive documentation left behind by the Kane family created risks that extended far beyond damage to individual reputations. What they called comprehensive suppression, a coordinated effort that involved local law enforcement, regional newspapers, and political authorities at the state level, was the decision made to implement. That Cordelia Ravenscraft had been killed during a random slave rebellion that was quickly suppressed with the perpetrators captured and executed to prevent similar incidents would be the official story. But eliminating all evidence of the experimental program, including the building itself and everyone who had knowledge of what had actually occurred, was required for creating a believable alternative narrative. To ensure that no one who had witnessed evidence of Cordelia's activities would be willing or able to share that information with outside authorities, a systematic campaign of intimidation, bribery, and threats would be implemented over the following weeks. As victims of unprovoked violence were the 2 overseers who had been killed described, with no mention of their role in Cordelia's experimental program. As captured and executed were the 7 members of the Kane family reported, though no bodies were ever produced and no public executions took place. Completely, the remote building was dismantled, with its materials burned and scattered to eliminate any physical evidence of what had occurred there. Too dangerous to allow survival in any form was declared the comprehensive written account left behind by the Kane family. Most importantly, multiple copies had apparently been prepared, and tracking down every version would require resources and coordination that extended across state boundaries and involved individuals whose own reputations depended on keeping the truth buried. That their efforts to suppress evidence of Cordelia's experimental program would create exactly the kind of mystery and speculation that would keep the story alive for generations was what the conspirators could not have anticipated. Into the kind of legend that would be whispered about in slave quarters and abolitionist meetings for decades to come would be transformed the Ravenscraft plantation tragedy by their success in eliminating official records. In preventing immediate public exposure of her experimental program, the coordinated cover-up effort that followed Cordelia's death succeeded, but it could not prevent the systematic destruction of everything the Ravencroft family had built over 2 generations. Within months of the March 15 incident, forces had been set in motion that would reduce Colonel Thaddeus Ravencroft from one of South Carolina's most respected planters to a broken man whose family name would become synonymous with scandal and shame. In late April, when unsigned letters began appearing in the offices of abolitionist newspapers throughout the North, came the first indication that the cover-up was failing. Detailed descriptions of Cordelia's experimental program were contained in these letters, accompanied by information that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of both the plantation's operations and the subsequent cover-up efforts. By someone with education and sophisticated understanding of how to present evidence in ways that would be credible to skeptical readers, the letters were clearly written. Specific details about plantation layouts, names of overseers, descriptions of equipment used in the experimental program, and, most damaging of all, direct quotes from correspondence between Cordelia and other plantation owners who had expressed interest in implementing similar methods were included by them. Their timing was what made these revelations particularly devastating. Throughout the North, momentum was being gained by the abolitionist movement, and exactly the kind of documentation that reformers needed to support their argument about the inherent brutality of the slavery system was provided by evidence of systematic torture programs on Southern plantations. A centerpiece of anti-slavery publications and speaking tours had become the Ravencroft plantation story within weeks. From within the Southern planter community itself came the real destruction, however. Questions they could not answer without admitting their own involvement in planning systematic torture were found to be faced by the other plantation owners who had been associated with Cordelia's experimental program. From Ravencroft, they began distancing themselves one by one, cancelling business relationships and spreading rumors designed to shift blame entirely onto the colonel and his deceased wife. Effectively ostracized from the social and business networks that formed the foundation of plantation society had Ravencroft been by summer 1823. Reasons to call in loans or refuse credit extensions were suddenly found by banks that had previously competed for his business. Immediate payment for goods that had traditionally been purchased on seasonal credit arrangements began to be demanded by merchants who had provided supplies for decades, actively discouraging their enslaved workers from any contact with Ravencroft's plantation, treating it as a source of dangerous ideas about resistance and rebellion, began other plantation owners, most devastating of all. Increasingly precarious was made Ravencroft's situation by the economic pressure, accompanied by political isolation. Throughout South Carolina's political establishment, his military rank, which had opened doors, became a liability as officials worried that association with him might damage their own reputations. Arriving, invitations to social gatherings stopped. Without explanation, business partnerships dissolved, and excuses to avoid encounters that might be observed by others were found by former friends. On the plantation's enslaved population was perhaps most devastating the effect, however. Throughout the region, word of the Kane family's successful resistance had spread, creating what authorities described as dangerous excitement among enslaved individuals who had previously accepted their situation with resignation.